A generous young boy named Jamie helps an elderly woman by fixing her old radio. Jamie believes he's done a good deed until the next day when Mrs. Harper arrives at his door with a social worker. This unexpected visit changes Jamie's life forever. Jamie pedals his bike down the leafy street, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He enjoys these peaceful afternoon rides through the neighborhood, appreciating the familiar sights and sounds. As he turns onto Oak Street, he notices something unusual. In front of a small blue house with a well-kept garden, Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman, is struggling with a vintage radio on her porch, her face a mix of frustration and determination. Hello, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below. Enjoy the story. Jamie slows his bike, feeling concern for his neighbor. Mrs. Harper has always been kind, often greeting him with a smile and sometimes offering fresh apples from her garden. But recently, Jamie noticed she seemed more isolated, spending less time outside. Without hesitation, Jamie steers his bike towards her house. As he gets closer, he hears her muttering under her breath, her hands shaking slightly as she tries to adjust the radio's dials. "Hi, Mrs. Harper," Jamie calls out gently, not wanting to startle her. "Is everything okay?" The old woman looks up, surprise flickering across her lined face. "Oh, hello, Jamie," she replies, her voice tinged with both warmth and frustration. "This old radio is acting up again. I was hoping to listen to some music this afternoon, but it just won't work." Jamie feels a surge of empathy. He knows how much Mrs. Harper loves her music. She often chats with his mom about old records. Seeing her so upset tugs at his heart. "Maybe I can help," Jamie offers, parking his bike and walking up to the porch. "I'm pretty good with electronics. Mind if I take a look?" Mrs. Harper's eyes light up with hope. "Oh, that would be wonderful, Jamie. I'd be so grateful." As Jamie kneels beside the radio, he notices how Mrs. Harper's tense shoulders seem to relax slightly. He realizes that perhaps she needs more than just her radio fixed. Maybe she needs a friend. Jamie carefully examines the radio, checking the wires and connections. Mrs. Harper watches in awe as the young boy works, his fingers moving with surprising confidence. After a few minutes of tinkering, Jamie looks up with a thoughtful expression. "I think I found the problem," he announces. "There's a loose connection here. Let me just..." He leans in, focusing intently on reconnecting a small wire. Suddenly, the radio crackles to life, the sound of a clear melody filling the air. Mrs. Harper's eyes widen in disbelief. "Oh my goodness!" she exclaims, clapping her hands together. "You did it, Jamie. You really did it." Jamie smiles modestly as he stands up, dusting off his hands. "It wasn't too hard. I'm just glad I could help." Tears of joy glisten in Mrs. Harper's eyes as she looks at Jamie. "Thank you so much, Jamie," she says, her voice thick with emotion. "This radio was a gift from my late husband. I thought I'd lost it forever." Jamie feels a lump in his throat. He hadn't realized how important the radio was to Mrs. Harper, and he is even happier now that he could fix it. Mrs. Harper's face suddenly brightens with an idea. "Oh, I know. Why don't you come inside for some lemonade? I just made a fresh batch this morning. It's the least I can do to thank you." Jamie's eyes light up at the mention of lemonade. "That sounds great, Mrs. Harper. Thank you." As they walk towards the house, Mrs. Harper places a gentle hand on Jamie's shoulder. "You're a very special young man, Jamie," she says softly. "Your parents must be so proud of you." Jamie feels a warm glow of happiness as they step inside. He hadn't just fixed a radio today. He had brought a smile to Mrs. Harper's face, and that felt even better than any electronic repair. Later, as Jamie sits at Mrs. Harper's kitchen table, enjoying a cold glass of lemonade, she starts sharing stories about her late husband, a kind man who loved to fix things just like Jamie. Her voice fills with warmth and nostalgia as she talks about their life together. As Jamie listens, he realizes that Mrs. Harper has been feeling lonely, and he's glad that he could be there for her. Mrs. Harper notices his thoughtful expression and gives him a gentle smile. "You know, Jamie," she says, "you're welcome to visit anytime you like. I'd love the company." Jamie's face brightens. "Really? That would be awesome, Mrs. Harper. I'd love to come visit you again." Mrs. Harper reaches out and gives Jamie's hand a gentle squeeze. You've brought so much joy into this old house today, Jamie. Thank you for that. Jamie pedals home, his heart light and his spirits soaring. As he turns into his driveway, he can't wait to tell his parents about his afternoon with Mrs. Harper. The next day, Jamie wakes up early, eager to visit Mrs. Harper again. After breakfast, he hops on his bike and pedals down the street, his heart full of anticipation. As he approaches Mrs. Harper's house, he sees her tending to her garden in the front yard. Her face lights up with a warm smile when she spots him. "Jamie, what a lovely surprise." Mrs. Harper calls out, waving her gardening gloves in the air. Jamie parks his bike and walks over to her. "Hi, Mrs. Harper. I just wanted to check on you and see how the radio's working." Mrs. Harper's eyes crinkle with joy. "Oh, it's working perfectly, dear. You did such a wonderful job. Would you like to come inside for a bit?" Jamie nods enthusiastically. "Sure, I'd love to." They make their way into the cozy living room, where the radio sits proudly on its stand. Mrs. Harper gestures for Jamie to take a seat on the sofa. "Can I get you something to drink? Maybe some iced tea?" she offers. "That sounds great, thank you," Jamie replies politely. As Mrs. Harper bustles about in the kitchen, Jamie looks around the room. Photos of a younger Mrs. Harper with a man in a military uniform catch his eye. When Mrs. Harper returns with 2 glasses of iced tea, Jamie can't help but ask, "Is that your husband in the photos?" Mrs. Harper's smile turns wistful. "Yes, that's my Robert. He served in the army for many years. He passed away a few years ago." Jamie feels a pang of sadness. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper. He looks like he was a great man. He was," she says softly, "the kindest, bravest soul I ever knew." They sit in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their iced tea. Then Mrs. Harper brightens up. "How about we listen to some music together? There's a lovely station that plays old jazz tunes." Jamie nods eagerly, and Mrs. Harper turns on the radio. As the smooth melodies fill the room, they chat about music and memories. The afternoon passes quickly, filled with laughter and stories. As the sun begins to dip lower in the sky, Jamie realizes it's time to head home. "I should probably get going, Mrs. Harper. Thank you for having me over." Mrs. Harper pats his hand gently. "Thank you for coming, Jamie. You've brightened my day more than you know." As the days turn into weeks, Jamie's visits to Mrs. Harper's house become a regular part of his routine. Every few days after school, he hops on his bike and pedals down the street, eager to spend time with his new friend. Mrs. Harper always greets him with a warm smile and open arms. "There's my favorite young man," she exclaims, her eyes twinkling with joy. They settle into a comfortable rhythm, spending their afternoons together in Mrs. Harper's cozy living room. Sometimes they listen to the radio, other times they just sit and talk. Jamie finds himself looking forward to these visits more and more. One sunny afternoon, as they sit sipping iced tea, Mrs. Harper pulls out an old photo album. "I thought you might like to see some pictures from when I was young," she says, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Jamie leans in closer, fascinated by the black and white photos. "Wow, Mrs. Harper, is that really you?" he asks, pointing to a picture of a young woman in a beautiful dress. Mrs. Harper chuckles. "Yes, that's me on my wedding day. I was just 22 years old." As they flip through the pages, Mrs. Harper shares stories from her past. She tells Jamie about growing up during simpler times, about meeting her husband Robert at a dance, and about the adventures they had together. "Robert and I traveled all over the country in our little camper van," she says, her eyes distant with memories. "Those were some of the happiest days of my life." Jamie listens intently, hanging on every word. He finds himself imagining what it must have been like to live in those times. In return, Jamie opens up to Mrs. Harper about his own dreams and aspirations. "I want to be an inventor when I grow up," he confides. "I love fixing things and figuring out how they work." Mrs. Harper nods approvingly. "That's wonderful, Jamie. You certainly have a talent for it. I bet you'll invent something amazing one day." Jamie beams at her words of encouragement. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Mrs. Harper replies with a gentle smile. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, young man." As they continue to share stories and dreams, the bond between them grows stronger. Jamie finds in Mrs. Harper a patient listener and a wise advisor, while Mrs. Harper discovers in Jamie a source of youthful energy and hope for the future. One evening, as the Johnson family sits down for dinner, they exchange knowing glances. They have noticed how excited Jamie always seems when he returns from Mrs. Harper's house, his eyes bright and his words tumbling out in a rush as he shares stories of their time together. "So, Jamie," Mr. Johnson begins, a smile playing on his lips, "you've been spending a lot of time with Mrs. Harper lately. How's she doing?" Jamie's face lights up at the mention of his elderly friend. "She's great, Dad. Today, she showed me old photos from when she was young. Did you know she and her husband traveled all over the country in a camper van?" Mrs. Johnson chuckles softly. "That sounds like quite an adventure. It's wonderful that she's sharing those memories with you." As Jamie continues to talk animatedly about his visits with Mrs. Harper, his parents listen attentively, their hearts swelling with pride. When there is a lull in the conversation, Mr. Johnson clears his throat. "You know, son," he says, his voice warm with emotion, "your mother and I are really proud of you for what you're doing for Mrs. Harper." Jamie looks up from his plate, surprised. "Really? But I'm not doing anything special. I just like spending time with her." Mrs. Johnson reaches out and squeezes Jamie's hand. "That's exactly what makes it special, sweetie. You're making a big difference in her life just by being there for her." Mr. Johnson nods in agreement. "That's right. We've noticed how much happier Mrs. Harper seems these days. Your friendship means a lot to her." Jamie feels a warm glow in his chest at his parents' words. He hadn't really thought about the impact he was having on Mrs. Harper's life. He just knew he enjoyed their time together. "We're so proud of you for recognizing that Mrs. Harper needed a friend." Mrs. Johnson continues, her eyes shining. "It takes a kind and compassionate heart to reach out to someone like that." Over the next few weeks, Jamie finds himself spending more and more time at Mrs. Harper's house. Each visit brings a new task for him to tackle, and he is always eager to help. One sunny afternoon, Jamie arrives to find Mrs. Harper struggling with a stubborn jar lid. "Oh, Jamie," she exclaims, relief washing over her face. "I'm so glad you're here. These old hands just aren't what they used to be." Jamie grins and takes the jar from her. With a quick twist, he pops the lid off. "There you go, Mrs. Harper. Easy peasy." Mrs. Harper's eyes crinkle with warmth. "What would I do without you, dear?" As the days go by, Jamie helps with all sorts of little jobs around the house. He changes light bulbs that are too high for Mrs. Harper to reach, waters her beloved plants, and even learns how to make her favorite tea just the way she likes it. One day, while Jamie is helping Mrs. Harper sort through old photo albums, she pauses on a picture of a young boy. "That's my late husband when he was about your age," she says softly. "You remind me so much of him, you know? Always ready to lend a hand. Always with a smile on your face." Jamie feels a lump form in his throat. "Really?" he asks, touched by the comparison. Mrs. Harper nods, her eyes misty. "Oh yes. If we'd been blessed with grandchildren, I imagine they might have been just like you." From that moment on, something shifts in their relationship. Mrs. Harper begins to fuss over Jamie like a grandmother would, always making sure he has a snack when he visits and checking if he's warm enough when the weather turns chilly. For Jamie, Mrs. Harper becomes more than just a neighbor he helps out. She's someone he can talk to about anything, someone who always has a wise word or a funny story to share. As autumn leaves begin to fall, Jamie realizes that what started as a simple act of kindness has blossomed into something much more precious. Mrs. Harper isn't just a neighbor anymore. She has become family. One crisp Saturday morning, Jamie wakes up with a bright idea. He bounces down the stairs, nearly tripping over his own feet in excitement. His parents are in the kitchen, sipping their morning coffee. "Mom, Dad," Jamie blurts out, "I want you to meet Mrs. Harper." Mr. Johnson lowers his newspaper, eyebrows raised. "The neighbor you've been helping out?" Jamie nods eagerly. "Yeah, she's really nice, and I think you'd like her." Mrs. Johnson smiles warmly. "That sounds lovely, honey. Why don't we go over this afternoon?" Jamie's face lights up. "Really? That'd be great." As the afternoon approaches, Jamie feels a mix of excitement and nerves. He wants his parents to like Mrs. Harper as much as he does. When the time comes, the Johnson family walks over to Mrs. Harper's house together. Jamie knocks on the door, bouncing on his toes. When Mrs. Harper opens it, her face breaks into a wide smile. "Jamie, what a wonderful surprise." "Hi, Mrs. Harper," Jamie says, beaming. "I wanted you to meet my parents." Mrs. Harper's eyes sparkle as she looks at Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. "Oh my, it's so nice to finally meet you. Please, come in." As they settle into Mrs. Harper's cozy living room, Jamie watches nervously as his parents and Mrs. Harper begin to chat. But his worry melts away as he sees his mom laughing at one of Mrs. Harper's jokes and his dad leaning in to hear a story about her late husband's time in the military. Mrs. Johnson turns to Jamie, her eyes soft with understanding. "Now I see why you enjoy spending time here so much, sweetie." Mrs. Harper is delightful. Mr. Johnson nods in agreement. "It's wonderful to see how much joy you two bring to each other's lives." Jamie feels a warm glow in his chest. He looks at Mrs. Harper, who winks at him, her eyes twinkling with happiness. In that moment, Jamie knows that his two families have become one, bound together by love and kindness. As the weeks pass, the Johnsons begin to include Mrs. Harper more and more in their family activities. It starts with a simple invitation to Sunday dinner. Mrs. Johnson calls Mrs. Harper on a Friday afternoon, her voice warm and welcoming. "Mrs. Harper, we'd love to have you join us for dinner this Sunday. Jamie talks about you so much. We feel like you're already part of the family." Mrs. Harper's voice quivers with emotion as she accepts the invitation. "Oh my, that's so kind of you. I'd be delighted." When Sunday arrives, Jamie can hardly contain his excitement. He helps his mom set the table, making sure everything is perfect for their special guest. When Mrs. Harper arrives, the house fills with the aroma of Mrs. Johnson's famous roast and the sound of cheerful conversation. During dinner, Mr. Johnson regales everyone with funny stories from work, while Mrs. Harper shares tales of her adventures with her late husband. Jamie watches with joy as his parents and Mrs. Harper laugh together, feeling like they've known each other for years. The Sunday dinners soon become a regular occurrence, and before long, the Johnsons are including Mrs. Harper in other family activities too. One sunny Saturday, they invite her to join them for a picnic at the local park. As they spread out their blanket under a shady tree, Mrs. Harper's eyes sparkle with delight. "I haven't been on a picnic in years," she confesses, her voice filled with wonder. Jamie helps her settle onto the blanket, making sure she's comfortable. They spend the afternoon eating sandwiches, playing frisbee, with Mrs. Harper cheering from the sidelines, and feeding the ducks at the pond. As the weeks turn into months, Mrs. Harper becomes a fixture in the Johnson family's life. She joins them for movie nights, helps Mrs. Johnson in her garden, and even comes along on a trip to the local museum. With each outing and shared meal, the bond between them grows stronger. For Mrs. Harper, these moments are like a rebirth. The loneliness that had once consumed her begins to fade, replaced by the warmth and love of her newfound family. And for Jamie, seeing the joy on Mrs. Harper's face whenever she's included in their activities fills his heart with happiness. One sunny afternoon, Jamie is sprawled on the living room floor, engrossed in his latest electronic project. His fingers deftly maneuver tiny wires and components as he hums a cheerful tune. The house is quiet, except for the occasional click of his tools and the soft whirring of the ceiling fan. Suddenly, a sharp knock at the front door breaks the peaceful silence. Jamie looks up, curiosity etched on his young face. Mr. Johnson, who has been reading the newspaper in his favorite armchair, sets aside his paper and stands up. "I'll get it," he calls out, making his way to the door. As Mr. Johnson opens the door, Jamie cranes his neck to see who it is. To his surprise, he sees Mrs. Harper standing on the porch, but she's not alone. Next to her stands a tall social worker in a neat uniform, her badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jamie's heart skips a beat, his mind racing with questions. Why is Mrs. Harper here with a social worker? Is something wrong? He scrambles to his feet, his project forgotten on the floor. Mr. Johnson's voice carries a note of concern as he greets their unexpected visitors. "Mrs. Harper, is everything all right?" Mrs. Harper's face is a mix of emotions, worry, excitement, and something else Jamie can't quite place. She wrings her hands nervously as she looks up at Mr. Johnson. "Oh, Mr. Johnson," she begins, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry to bother you like this, but something's happened, and I didn't know who else to turn to. The social worker beside her nods solemnly, her presence both reassuring and serious. Jamie inches closer to the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Mr. Johnson steps aside, gesturing for Mrs. Harper and the social worker to enter. "Please, come in," he says, his voice tinged with concern. Mrs. Johnson emerges from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her eyes wide with surprise. Jamie stands rooted to the spot, his young mind whirling with questions. He watches as the adults file into the living room, his stomach knotting with anxiety. What could have happened to bring Mrs. Harper here with a social worker? "Can I get you anything? Water? Tea?" Mrs. Johnson offers, her hospitable nature kicking in despite the tension in the air. Mrs. Harper shakes her head, her silver hair catching the light. "No, thank you, dear. I'm sorry to intrude like this." The social worker, a tall woman with kind eyes, nods respectfully to the Johnsons. "Ma'am, sir, I'm Ms. Brown. Mrs. Harper asked me to accompany her here." Jamie inches closer to his parents, seeking comfort in their presence. His father places a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but Jamie can feel the slight tremor in it. "What's going on?" Mr. Johnson asks, his voice calm but laced with worry. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Harper?" Mrs. Harper wrings her hands, her eyes darting between the Johnsons and Ms. Brown. "I didn't know who else to turn to," she repeats, her voice quavering. Jamie's heart races. He's never seen Mrs. Harper so upset before. In all their afternoons together, she has always been a pillar of strength and wisdom. Seeing her so distressed makes him feel scared and helpless. "Maybe we should all sit down," Mrs. Johnson suggests gently, guiding Mrs. Harper to the couch. The others follow suit, with Jamie perching on the armrest next to his mother. Ms. Brown clears her throat, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Jamie, I want to assure you that there's no trouble here. No one's in any danger or has done anything wrong." A collective sigh of relief fills the room. Jamie feels some of the tension leave his shoulders, but his curiosity only grows stronger. Mrs. Harper dabs at her eyes with a tissue Mrs. Johnson had quietly passed to her. "I'm so sorry for alarming you all," she begins, her voice trembling. "It's just, well, I've been thinking a lot about my dear Robert lately." Jamie knows that Robert was Mrs. Harper's late husband, a dedicated military man she often spoke fondly of during their afternoon chats. "You see," Mrs. Harper continues, tears welling up in her eyes, "today would have been our 50th wedding anniversary." Her voice cracks, and she pauses to compose herself. The Johnsons exchange sympathetic glances, while Jamie feels a lump forming in his throat. He's never seen Mrs. Harper cry before, and it makes his heart ache. "I was feeling so alone," Mrs. Harper goes on, "and I found myself at the community center where Robert used to volunteer. That's where I met Ms. Brown." She gestures toward the social worker. Ms. Brown nods, a gentle smile on her face. "Mrs. Harper told me about her husband, about their life together, and about the wonderful friendship she's formed with your family, especially with Jamie here." Jamie feels a warm glow of pride at Ms. Brown's words, but it's quickly overshadowed by concern for Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Harper reaches out and takes Jamie's hand in hers. "Jamie, you've brought so much joy into my life these past few weeks. You've reminded me what it's like to have family around." She turns to face the Johnsons, her eyes brimming with emotion. "And you've all been so kind, including me in your lives." She pauses, taking a deep breath. "I realize today that I don't want to be alone anymore. I hope." Mrs. Harper's voice falters, overcome with emotion. Mrs. Harper takes a deep breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My Robert," she begins, her voice soft and filled with love, "was a dedicated volunteer. He spent his life helping others, always putting the community first." Jamie listens intently, his young heart swelling with admiration for Mrs. Harper's late husband. He'd heard bits and pieces about Robert before, but never the full story. Robert believed that kindness was the most powerful force in the world. Mrs. Harper continues, squeezing Jamie's hand gently. "He used to say that a single act of kindness could change someone's entire life." The Johnsons nod. exchanging glances that speak volumes about their understanding of this simple yet profound truth. Mrs. Harper turns to Jamie, her eyes filled with warmth. And you, dear Jamie, you've proven Robert right. Your kindness, it's filled a void in my heart that I thought would never be whole again. Jamie feels a lump forming in his throat, touched by Mrs. Harper's words. He hadn't realized just how much his simple acts of friendship had meant to her. When Robert passed away, Mrs. Harper's voice quivers slightly. I felt so alone. It was like a part of me had gone with him. But then you came along, Jamie, with your bright smile and your willingness to help. She pauses, looking around at the Johnsons. And all of you, welcoming me into your lives. It's been like finding a family again. Ms. Brown nods, a gentle smile on her face. Mrs. Harper told me how you fixed her radio, Jamie, and how that simple act of kindness blossomed into this beautiful friendship. Jamie blushes, feeling both proud and humbled. He hadn't thought his actions were anything special, but clearly, they had made a huge difference in Mrs. Harper's life. You see, Mrs. Harper continues, her voice growing stronger, Jamie's kindness didn't just fix my radio. It fixed something in me that I thought was broken forever. It reminded me of the joy of connection, of family. Mrs. Harper's eyes well up with tears as she continues her story. You see, Robert and I, we never had children of our own, she says, her voice barely above a whisper. The room falls silent, everyone hanging on her every word. Jamie feels a pang in his heart. He's never known this about Mrs. Harper, and it makes him understand her loneliness even more. After Robert passed, Mrs. Harper goes on, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I felt so alone. The house was so quiet, so empty. I didn't know what to do with myself. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson exchange sympathetic glances, their hearts going out to their elderly neighbor. Mrs. Harper turns to Jamie, her eyes shining with affection. But then you came along, Jamie. Your visits, your kindness, it's been like a ray of sunshine in my life. Jamie feels a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized just how much his visits had meant to Mrs. Harper. Every time you come over, every story we share, every moment we spend together. Mrs. Harper continues, her voice growing stronger. It fills my heart with so much joy. It's like having the grandson I never had. Jamie's eyes widen at these words. He feels a warmth spread through his chest, a mix of surprise and happiness. Mrs. Harper reaches out and takes Jamie's hand in hers. You've become family to me, Jamie. You've brought laughter back into my home, purpose back into my days. Jamie squeezes her hand gently, feeling the depth of her words. He looks up at his parents, seeing their proud smiles, and then back at Mrs. Harper. I feel the same way, Mrs. Harper, Jamie says softly. I love spending time with you. You're like family to me too. Mrs. Harper's face lights up with joy, her earlier tears now replaced by a radiant smile. The bond between them, forged through simple acts of kindness, has grown into something beautiful and profound. The social worker, who has been sitting quietly by Mrs. Harper's side, steps forward, her eyes kind and her smile gentle as she addresses the Johnson family. I'm Ms. Brown, she says, her voice warm and reassuring. I was a close friend of Robert, Mrs. Harper's late husband. Jamie looks up at the social worker, curiosity filling his eyes. He can see the respect and admiration in Ms. Brown's face as she speaks about Mrs. Harper's husband. Robert was one of the finest volunteers I've ever known, Ms. Brown continues. He dedicated his life to helping others and making our community a better place. Mrs. Harper nods, a proud smile on her face as she remembers her husband. That's right, she says softly. Robert always believed in giving back to the community. Ms. Brown turns to Jamie, her expression serious but kind. Mrs. Harper has told me all about you, Jamie, about how you've been helping her and keeping her company. It's exactly the kind of thing Robert would have loved to see. Jamie feels a mix of emotions, pride, happiness, and a touch of shyness at being the center of attention. He hadn't realized his simple acts of kindness would mean so much to so many people. You see, Ms. Brown explains, Mrs. Harper wants to honor Robert's legacy, and she believes the best way to do that is by supporting you, Jamie. Jamie's eyes widen in surprise. He looks at Mrs. Harper, who who is smiling at him with tears in her eyes. "That's right, dear," Mrs. Harper says, her voice filled with emotion. "Robert always believed in investing in the future, in helping young people reach their full potential. And that's exactly what I want to do for you." Mr. and Mrs. Johnson listen intently, their faces a mix of surprise and gratitude. They hadn't expected this turn of events when Mrs. Harper and Ms. Brown had arrived at their door. "Mrs. Harper has set up a college fund for you, Jamie," Ms. Brown explains. "She wants to make sure you have the opportunity to pursue your dreams, just like Robert would have wanted." Jamie is stunned. He looks from Ms. Brown to Mrs. Harper, then to his parents, trying to process this incredible news. The kindness he had shown, the friendship he had offered, is coming back to him in ways he could never have imagined. Ms. Brown reaches into her pocket and pulls out an envelope. With a warm smile, she hands it to Jamie. "Mrs. Harper asked me to give this to you," she says gently. Jamie's hands tremble slightly as he takes the envelope. He looks at Mrs. Harper, who nods encouragingly, her eyes brimming with tears of joy. "Go ahead, dear," Mrs. Harper says softly. "Read it." Jamie carefully opens the envelope and unfolds the letter inside. As he begins to read, his eyes widen and his mouth falls open in astonishment. "Dear Jamie," the letter begins, "your kindness and compassion have touched my heart in ways I never thought possible. You've brought light back into my life, reminding me of the goodness that still exists in this world." Jamie's parents lean in, listening intently as their son reads the letter aloud. Mrs. Johnson places a comforting hand on her husband's shoulder, both of them overwhelmed by the generosity they are witnessing. "To honor my husband's memory and to ensure that your bright spirit continues to shine, I've decided to set up a scholarship fund in your name," Jamie reads, his voice quivering with emotion. "This fund will provide you with the means to pursue your dreams, whatever they may be." Mrs. Harper smiles softly, watching as Jamie absorbs the news. "I want you to have every opportunity to make a difference in this world, just as you've made a difference in mine," the letter continues. Jamie looks up from the letter, his eyes meeting Mrs. Harper's. I don't know what to say," he whispers, overcome with gratitude. Ms. Brown steps forward, placing a gentle hand on Jamie's shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, son. Your actions have spoken louder than words ever could." Jamie lowers the letter, his hands shaking slightly. He looks up at Mrs. Harper, his eyes glistening with tears. The room falls silent for a moment as the weight of her generosity settles over everyone. Mrs. Johnson is the first to break the silence. "Oh, Mrs. Harper," she says, her voice thick with emotion. It's just incredible." Mr. Johnson nods in agreement, wiping a tear from his eye. "We don't know how to thank you for this," he adds, his voice barely above a whisper. Jamie stands up slowly, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. He walks over to Mrs. Harper, who opens her arms wide. Without hesitation, Jamie falls into her embrace, burying his face in her shoulder as tears stream down his cheeks. "Thank you," Jamie mumbles into Mrs. Harper's sweater. "Thank you so much." Mrs. Harper pats Jamie's back gently, her own tears falling freely now. "No, my dear boy," she says softly, "it is I who should be thanking you. You've brought so much joy into my life." Mr. and Mrs. Johnson join the embrace, enveloping both Jamie and Mrs. Harper in a group hug. The room is filled with sniffles and quiet sobs as they all share in this moment of overwhelming gratitude and love. Ms. Brown stands to the side, watching the scene with a warm smile. She can't help but feel moved by the display of kindness and generosity before her. As they pull apart, Jamie looks up at Mrs. Harper with red-rimmed eyes. "I promise I'll make you proud," he says earnestly. "I'll use this opportunity to help others, just like you and your husband did." Mrs. Harper cups Jamie's face in her hands, her eyes twinkling with affection. "My dear, you've already made me prouder than I could have ever imagined," she says, her voice full of warmth. As the emotional moment subsides, Mrs. Harper reaches into her purse with trembling hands. She pulls out a small velvet box and holds it gently, her eyes misting over with memories. "Jamie," she says softly, "there's something else I'd like to give you." Jamie looks at her curiously, his eyes still damp from tears. Mrs. Harper opens the box, revealing a beautiful antique watch nestled inside. The gold face gleams in the soft light of the living room, its hands ticking steadily. "This was my husband's most cherished possession," Mrs. Harper explains, her voice filled with emotion. "He wore it every day of his service, and it became a symbol of his dedication to helping others." Jamie's eyes widen as he realizes the significance of the gift. He looks from the watch to Mrs. Harper, then back to the watch again, unable to find words. Mrs. Harper gently takes the watch from its box and holds it out to Jamie. "I want you to have it," she says. "It's a reminder of the legacy of love and selflessness that you're now a part of." With shaking hands, Jamie accepts the watch. He turns it over in his palms, marveling at its weight and the intricate engravings on the back. He can feel the history and love pulsing through it. "Mrs. Harper, I don't know what to say," Jamie stammers, overwhelmed by the gesture. "This is too much." Mrs. Harper shakes her head, smiling through her tears. "It's exactly right, my dear. You've shown the same kindness and selflessness that my husband did every day of his life. This watch belongs with you now." Jamie carefully fastens the watch around his wrist, feeling its comforting weight. He looks up at Mrs. Harper, his eyes shining with determination and gratitude. "I promise," he says solemnly, "I'll honor this gift. I'll wear it every day and remember the kindness and love it represents. I'll do my best to live up to the legacy it carries." Mrs. Harper pulls Jamie into another warm embrace, her heart swelling with pride and affection. "I know you will, my dear," she whispers. "I know you will." The Johnsons exchange a meaningful glance, their hearts full of warmth and love for both Jamie and Mrs. Harper. Mr. Johnson clears his throat, his voice filled with emotion as he speaks. "Mrs. Harper," he begins, "we've been thinking about something important." Mrs. Harper looks up, her eyes still glistening with tears of joy. She tilts her head, curious about what Mr. Johnson has to say. Mrs. Johnson steps forward, placing a gentle hand on Mrs. Harper's shoulder. "We've seen how much joy you've brought into Jamie's life and into ours," she says softly. "You've become such an important part of our family." Jamie's eyes light up, sensing where this conversation is heading. He looks from his parents to Mrs. Harper, a hopeful smile spreading across his face. Mr. Johnson continues, his voice warm and sincere. "We'd like to ask you, Mrs. Harper, if you'd consider becoming a permanent part of our family. We want you to know that you'll always have a place with us, not just as a neighbor or a friend, but as family." Mrs. Harper's hand flies to her mouth, her eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, she is speechless, overwhelmed by the offer. You want me to be part of your family?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Johnson nods, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, we do. We'd be honored if you'd accept." Jamie steps forward, taking Mrs. Harper's hand in his. "Please say yes," he says earnestly. "You're already like a grandmother to me." Mrs. Harper looks around at the loving faces surrounding her. She feels a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling of belonging she hasn't experienced in years. Tears of joy stream down her cheeks as she nods. "Yes," she says, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I'd love to be part of your family. You've given me so much already, and now this? I can't express how grateful I am." The Johnsons envelop Mrs. Harper in a group hug, with Jamie in the middle, his arms wrapped tightly around his newfound grandmother. The room is filled with laughter and happy tears as they celebrate their expanded family. As the weeks turn into months, Jamie throws himself into his studies with renewed vigor. The love and support from his new grandmother, Mrs. Harper, fuel his determination to excel in school. Every afternoon, after finishing his classes, Jamie rushes over to Mrs. Harper's house, eager to share his day's achievements with her. Mrs. Harper's face lights up each time Jamie bursts through her door, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a stack of books tucked under his arm. She listens intently as he excitedly recounts his lessons, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Guess what, Grandma Harper?" Jamie exclaims one day, practically bouncing with excitement. "I got an A+ on my science project." Mrs. Harper beams with pride. "That's wonderful, Jamie. I knew you could do it. Tell me all about your project." As Jamie launches into a detailed explanation of his experiment, Mrs. Harper can't help but feel a surge of love for this bright, hard-working boy who has become such an important part of her life. The knowledge of the scholarship fund Mrs. Harper has set up for him is a constant source of motivation for Jamie. He understands the incredible opportunity he has been given and is determined to make the most of it. Late nights spent poring over textbooks and early mornings reviewing notes become a regular part of his routine. Jamie's teachers notice the change in him too. His hand is always the first to shoot up in class, eager to answer questions. His assignments are consistently well-researched and thoughtfully presented. Even subjects he had previously struggled with begin to improve as he applies himself with newfound determination. One evening, as Jamie sits at Mrs. Harper's kitchen table working on his homework, she brings him a plate of warm cookies and a glass of milk. She watches him for a moment, her heart swelling with pride and affection. "You know, Jamie," she says softly, "your hard work is truly inspiring. You have such a bright future ahead of you." Jamie looks up from his textbook, a grateful smile spreading across his face. "It's all thanks to you, Grandma Harper," he replies. "Your support and the scholarship fund. It makes me want to do my very best." As the seasons change, Mrs. Harper becomes an integral part of the Johnson family. Her presence is a constant source of warmth and wisdom, filling their home with love and laughter. One crisp autumn afternoon, Mrs. Harper sits in the bleachers at Jamie's school, her eyes twinkling with pride as she watches him take center stage for the science fair. Jamie's project, a complex model of renewable energy sources, stands proudly on display as he explains his work to the judges. Mrs. Harper leans forward, hanging on every word. "That's my grandson," she whispers to the woman sitting next to her, her voice brimming with joy. Later that evening, as the Johnsons celebrate Jamie's first-place ribbon over a homemade dinner, Mrs. Harper regales them with stories of her late husband's adventures in the military. Jamie listens intently, his imagination painting vivid pictures of bravery and dedication. As the school year progresses, Mrs. Harper becomes a familiar face at parent-teacher conferences and school events. She sits beside Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, beaming with pride as Jamie's teachers praise his hard work and improvement. On weekday afternoons, Mrs. Harper's kitchen table becomes a hub of learning. She sits patiently beside Jamie, helping him with his homework and sharing her own experiences to bring his lessons to life. Her stories about the Great Depression make history leap off the pages, and her practical knowledge of fractions, honed through years of adjusting recipes, makes math problems less daunting. "You know, Jamie," Mrs. Harper says one day as they pore over his social studies textbook, "when I was your age, we didn't have all these fancy gadgets. We had to learn things the old-fashioned way." Jamie looks up, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Really? How did you manage?" Mrs. Harper chuckles, launching into a story about her school days that has Jamie giggling and asking for more. As winter approaches, the Johnsons invite Mrs. Harper to move into their spare room. The invitation brings tears to her eyes, and she accepts with a grateful heart. Now, every morning begins with the aroma of Mrs. Harper's famous pancakes filling the house, and every evening ends with the family gathered in the living room, sharing stories and laughter. As the winter months pass, Jamie and Mrs. Harper's bond grows stronger with each passing day. Their afternoons together become a cherished ritual, filled with laughter, learning, and heartfelt conversations. One snowy afternoon, as they sit by the fireplace sipping hot cocoa, Mrs. Harper's eyes twinkle with mischief. "You know, Jamie," she says, her voice warm with affection, "when I was your age, I dreamed of becoming a famous chef." Jamie's eyes widen with surprise. "Really? I didn't know that." Mrs. Harper nods, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "Oh yes, I used to spend hours in the kitchen with my mother, learning all her secret recipes." Jamie leans forward, eager to hear more. "What happened to that dream?" "Life, my dear," Mrs. Harper replies softly. "I met your grandpa, fell in love, and found a new dream, building a life with him." Jamie ponders this for a moment. "Do you ever regret not becoming a chef?" Mrs. Harper shakes her head firmly. "Not for a second. Sometimes our dreams change, and that's okay. The life I had with your grandpa was more wonderful than any dream I could have imagined." Inspired by Mrs. Harper's story, Jamie begins to share his own dreams. He tells her about his desire to become an inventor, to create things that will help people and make the world a better place. Mrs. Harper listens intently, her eyes shining with pride. "You have such a big heart, Jamie," she says, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I have no doubt you'll do amazing things." As the weeks go by, their conversations deepen. Jamie confides in Mrs. Harper about his fears and insecurities, things he sometimes finds hard to share with his parents. Mrs. Harper, in turn, opens up about her own struggles, sharing stories of resilience and perseverance that inspire Jamie. Their mutual admiration grows with each story shared. Jamie marvels at Mrs. Harper's strength and wisdom, while Mrs. Harper finds herself constantly amazed by Jamie's kindness and curiosity. One evening, as they work together on a jigsaw puzzle, Jamie looks up at Mrs. Harper with a serious expression. "You know, Mrs. Harper," he says softly, "I'm really glad you're part of our family now." Mrs. Harper's eyes well up with tears of joy. "Oh, Jamie," she replies, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much that means to me. You've brought so much happiness into my life." As spring approaches, Jamie finds himself grappling with a daunting school project. His teacher has assigned the class to create a presentation about a significant historical event and its impact on modern society. Jamie feels overwhelmed, unsure of where to begin or how to approach such a complex task. One afternoon, as he sits at Mrs. Harper's kitchen table, his brow furrowed in concentration, Mrs. Harper notices his distress. "What's troubling you, dear?" she asks gently, setting a plate of freshly baked cookies in front of him. Jamie sighs, pushing his textbook away. "It's this big project for school," he explains. "I just don't know how to make it interesting or where to start." Mrs. Harper's eyes light up. "Oh, history. That was always my favorite subject," she says, pulling up a chair beside him. "What's the project about?" As Jamie describes the assignment, Mrs. Harper listens intently. When he finishes, she smiles warmly. "You know, this reminds me of a project I did when I was about your age," she begins, her voice taking on a storytelling quality that instantly captures Jamie's attention. Mrs. Harper shares how she had struggled with a similar assignment until her grandfather helped her see history as a collection of real people's stories rather than just dates and facts. She describes how she had brought her presentation to life by focusing on personal accounts and everyday objects from the time period. Inspired by Mrs. Harper's story, Jamie's eyes begin to sparkle with newfound enthusiasm. "That's so cool," he exclaims. "I never thought about history that way before." Encouraged by his reaction, Mrs. Harper continues to share more experiences from her past. She tells Jamie about the creative ways she had tackled difficult school projects, emphasizing the importance of thinking outside the box and approaching challenges with confidence. As they talk, Jamie begins to jot down ideas, his earlier frustration replaced by excitement. Mrs. Harper watches him with pride, offering gentle guidance and encouragement as he works. "Remember, Jamie," she says softly, "every great achievement starts with believing in yourself. You have wonderful ideas and a kind heart. Let that shine through in your project." Jamie nods, feeling a surge of confidence. With Mrs. Harper's insights and his own creativity, he knows he can create something truly special. As he continues to brainstorm, Jamie feels grateful for Mrs. Harper's wisdom and support, realizing once again how lucky he is to have her in his life. With Mrs. Harper's guidance and his newfound enthusiasm, Jamie throws himself into his school project. He spends hours researching, crafting, and perfecting his presentation. The days fly by as he works tirelessly, fueled by his passion and the encouragement of his newfound grandmother. On the day of the presentation, Jamie stands before his class with confidence. His project, a vivid and engaging exploration of the civil rights movement, captivates his classmates and teacher alike. He uses personal stories and everyday objects to bring the era to life, just as Mrs. Harper had suggested. As Jamie speaks, his voice filled with passion and understanding, his teacher's eyes widen with surprise and delight. His classmates listen intently, drawn in by the unique approach he has taken. When he finishes, the room erupts in applause. "Jamie, that was exceptional," his teacher exclaims, beaming with pride. "Your presentation truly brought history to life. I've never seen such a creative and engaging approach from a student your age." Jamie's cheeks flush with pride as his classmates chime in with their own compliments. He feels a warmth spreading through his chest, knowing that he has done well. Later that day, as Jamie bursts through the door of Mrs. Harper's house, his face is alight with excitement. "Mrs. Harper, Mrs. Harper," he calls out, barely able to contain his joy. "I did it. My project was a huge success." Mrs. Harper's face lights up with delight as Jamie recounts every detail of his presentation and the praise he had received. She listens intently, her eyes brimming with pride and affection. "Oh, Jamie," she says, pulling him into a warm hug. "I'm so proud of you. But remember, this success is all yours. You did the hard work." Jamie shakes his head, his eyes serious. "No, Mrs. Harper, I couldn't have done it without you. Your stories and advice made all the difference. You helped me see history in a whole new way." Mrs. Harper's eyes glisten with tears of joy. She pats Jamie's hand gently, feeling a surge of love for this remarkable young boy who has brought so much light into her life. As the days pass, Mrs. Harper begins sharing more stories about her late husband, Robert. She speaks of his unwavering commitment to justice, his kindness towards others, and his belief in the power of community. Jamie listens intently, his young mind soaking up every word. One sunny afternoon, as they sit on Mrs. Harper's porch, she holds her husband's badge in her wrinkled hands. "You know, Jamie," she begins, her voice soft with memory, "Robert always said that true strength comes from helping others." Jamie leans in, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Really? How did he help people?" Mrs. Harper smiles, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, in so many ways. He'd go out of his way to help a lost child find their parent, or buy a meal for someone who couldn't afford it. He believed that every small act of kindness could change the world." Jamie nods thoughtfully, mulling over her words. "That's amazing, Mrs. Harper. I want to be like that too." "You already are, dear," Mrs. Harper says, patting his hand. "Your kindness to me is proof of that. But there's always more we can do." Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Harper continues to share her husband's principles with Jamie. She tells him about the importance of honesty, the value of hard work, and the need for empathy in all aspects of life. Jamie takes these lessons to heart. At school, he starts standing up for kids who are being bullied. At home, he helps his parents more without being asked. And in the neighborhood, he looks for ways to lend a hand, just like Robert used to do. One day, Jamie spots old Mr. Jenkins struggling with his groceries. Without hesitation, he rushes over to help. As they walk to Mr. Jenkins' house, Jamie thinks about how proud Mrs. Harper and Robert would be. Later, when he tells Mrs. Harper about it, her eyes well up with tears of joy. "Oh, Jamie," she says, her voice thick with emotion. "Robert would have been so proud of you. You're carrying on his legacy in the most beautiful way." Jamie feels a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He realizes that through Mrs. Harper's stories and lessons, Robert's spirit lives on, and now it's a part of him too. Jamie's heart races with excitement as he steps into the bustling community center. The colorful posters on the walls and the cheerful chatter of volunteers fill him with a sense of purpose. He remembers Mrs. Harper's stories about her late husband's dedication to helping others, and he feels inspired to follow in those footsteps. The center's coordinator, Ms. Thompson, greets Jamie with a warm smile. "Welcome, Jamie. We're so glad to have you here. Are you ready to make a difference?" Jamie nods eagerly. "Yes, ma'am. I want to help in any way I can." Ms. Thompson shows Jamie around the center, explaining the various programs they offer. There's a food bank, after-school tutoring, and even a small library. Jamie's eyes widen as he realizes how many ways there are to help people in his community. For his first task, Jamie is assigned to help sort donations for the food bank. He carefully organizes cans and boxes, making sure everything is in its proper place. As he works, he thinks about how each item will help feed a family in need. It makes him feel good inside, knowing he's making a real difference. Over the next few weeks, Jamie becomes a regular face at the community center. He helps with homework in the after-school program, reads stories to younger kids in the library, and even assists in organizing a neighborhood cleanup day. One afternoon, as Jamie is helping an elderly man choose books from the library shelves, he overhears Ms. Thompson talking to another volunteer. That Jamie is something special, she says. He reminds me of Robert, always ready to lend a hand, always with a smile on his face. Jamie feels a surge of pride at the comparison. He's living up to the example set by Mrs. Harper's husband, and it feels amazing. As the weeks turn into months, Jamie finds himself looking forward to his time at the community center more and more. The sense of fulfillment he gets from helping others is unlike anything he's ever experienced before. He loves seeing the grateful smiles on people's faces and knowing that he has made their day just a little bit brighter. One day, after a particularly busy afternoon at the center, Jamie sits down with Mrs. Harper to share his experiences. His eyes sparkle with excitement as he tells her about all the ways he's helping people. Mrs. Harper listens intently, her face beaming with pride. "Oh, Jamie," she says, her voice filled with emotion. "You're doing exactly what Robert would have wanted. You're making this world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time." Jamie trudges home from school, his shoulders slumped and his head hanging low. He has just received his math test results, and the big red D at the top of the page feels like a punch to his stomach. As he walks through his front door, he can barely muster a greeting to his parents before heading straight to his room. Later that evening, Jamie sits on Mrs. Harper's porch, staring at his feet. He had come over for their usual chat, but he can't bring himself to share his disappointment. Mrs. Harper notices the change in Jamie's demeanor immediately. "What's troubling you, son?" she asks gently, her warm brown eyes filled with concern. Jamie sighs heavily. "I failed my math test, Mrs. Harper," he admits, his voice barely above a whisper. "I studied so hard, but I just couldn't get it. Maybe I'm not as smart as everyone thinks I am." Mrs. Harper's heart aches for the boy she has come to love as her own grandson. She reaches out and pats his hand softly. "Oh, Jamie," she says, her voice full of understanding. "Everyone faces setbacks sometimes. It doesn't mean you're not smart or capable." Jamie looks up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Really?" Mrs. Harper nods, a small smile playing on her lips. "Let me tell you a story about Robert and me," she begins. "When we were first married, Robert was studying to become a volunteer coordinator. He struggled with some of the written exams, just like you're struggling with math now." Jamie listens intently as Mrs. Harper continues. "Robert was so discouraged. He thought about giving up his dream, but we faced it together. We studied every night, made flashcards, and even turned it into a game. It wasn't easy, but Robert didn't give up." "What happened?" Jamie asks, his curiosity piqued. "Well, Robert passed his exams with flying colors," Mrs. Harper says proudly, "and he went on to become one of the best coordinators in the community. The key was persistence and not being afraid to ask for help." Jamie feels a glimmer of hope stirring in his chest. "So you think I can do better next time?" Mrs. Harper squeezes his hand. "I know you can, son. And remember, Robert and I didn't face that challenge alone. We had each other. You have me, your parents, and your teachers. Don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it." With Mrs. Harper's words of encouragement ringing in his ears, Jamie feels a renewed sense of determination. He takes a deep breath and nods, his eyes shining with newfound resolve. "You're right, Mrs. Harper," he says, his voice stronger now. "I won't give up. I'll try harder and ask for help when I need it." Mrs. Harper beams at him, her face radiating pride. "That's the spirit, son. Now, why don't we start by looking at that math test of yours? Maybe we can figure out where you went wrong together." Jamie hesitates for a moment, then reaches into his backpack and pulls out the crumpled test paper. As they go through the problems one by one, Mrs. Harper patiently explains the concepts Jamie had struggled with. She uses simple, everyday examples to make the math more relatable, just as she and Robert had done years ago. Over the next few weeks, Jamie throws himself into his studies with renewed vigor. He stays after school for extra help from his math teacher, works on practice problems with Mrs. Harper, and even asks his parents to quiz him at dinner time. It isn't always easy, and there are moments when he feels like giving up, but he remembers Mrs. Harper's story about Robert and pushes through. When the next math test rolls around, Jamie feels nervous but prepared. As he works through the problems, he can almost hear Mrs. Harper's gentle voice guiding him. When he finally turns in his paper, he feels a sense of accomplishment, regardless of the outcome. A few days later, Jamie bursts into Mrs. Harper's house, waving his test paper in the air. "I did it, Mrs. Harper," he exclaims, his face split into a wide grin. "I got AB+. Mrs. Harper's eyes well up with happy tears as she hugs Jamie tightly. "Oh, my son, I'm so proud of you," she says, her voice filled with emotion. "You see, with hard work and perseverance, you can overcome anything." Jamie nods, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He realizes that this experience has taught him more than just math. He has learned the value of not giving up, of asking for help, and of having people who believe in him. As he sits with Mrs. Harper, sharing his success, Jamie feels grateful for the strong support system he has in his life. As the sun begins to set, casting a warm golden glow through Mrs. Harper's living room window, Jamie and Mrs. Harper settle comfortably on the couch. The radio hums softly in the background, but neither of them pays much attention to it. Their focus is on each other and the comfortable silence they share. Jamie glances down at the watch on his wrist, Mrs. Harper's late husband's cherished timepiece. He runs his fingers over its smooth surface, feeling a deep sense of responsibility and honor. The watch isn't just a gift. It's a symbol of trust, love, and the unbreakable bond they have formed. Mrs. Harper notices Jamie's gesture and smiles softly. She reaches out and takes his hand in hers, her wrinkled fingers intertwining with his young ones. The contrast is stark yet beautiful, a testament to the bridge their friendship has built between generations. "You know, my son," Mrs. Harper says, her voice warm and filled with emotion, "when Robert passed away, I thought my days of feeling truly happy were over. But you brought the sunshine back into my life." Jamie feels a lump form in his throat. He squeezes Mrs. Harper's hand gently. "And you've changed my life too, Mrs. Harper," he replies, his voice thick with emotion. "You've taught me so much about kindness and what it means to really help someone." They sit in silence for a moment, both overwhelmed by the depth of their connection. The ticking of the watch seems to echo the beating of their hearts in perfect sync, despite the years between them. As they sit there, hand in hand, the true impact of their relationship becomes crystal clear. What started as a simple act of kindness, a young boy helping an elderly neighbor with a broken radio, has blossomed into something profound and life-changing for both of them. Tears well up in Mrs. Harper's eyes as she looks at Jamie. In him, she sees not just the grandson she never had, but also a bright future full of hope and compassion. And Jamie, looking at Mrs. Harper, sees wisdom, unconditional love, and a living example of the person he aspires to become.